Hello and welcome back to Lesson 6-4, the home front. Today we're going to be looking at what was going on within the United States during World War II. During World War II, Americans built over 60% of the equipment used by the Allies. This equipment includes jeeps, tanks, airplanes, boats, bullets. This was all created, or 60% of this was created in the United States. For obvious reasons, the United States was not the site of war. American cities were not being bombed. So our workforce was able to fully engage in this and not worry about national defense. The U.S. also increased our spending far beyond what the New Deal programs had done. See, during the Great Depression, economists had argued that the New Deal would not get us out of the Depression because we weren't spending enough money. World War II seems to have proven that point, that when we increased our spending way above New Deal program levels, we were able to pull out of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression did end in the first year of U.S. involvement in World War II. Now, back on the home front, there were several things that Americans had to cope with, and one of which was rationing. Rationing came about because many goods were scarce. The economy was booming. The economy was doing very well. Factories were up and running and producing like they hadn't in years, but they were producing war goods, not goods for home. And other things that were being produced were being sent for the soldiers, not for use at home. An example is coffee. During the war, it became incredibly difficult to get coffee in the United States because the coffee was being sent overseas with American troops to make sure that our soldiers had all the coffee that they needed to stay awake for those night shifts. So the goods were rationed so the Army could have everything they needed. Another example of this is copper. Copper was used in bullet casings and other things needed in the military. So we went so far as to make steel pennies during World War II. Pennies didn't use copper so that the copper could be used in the war effort. Additionally, just like we saw in World War I, Americans spent extra money on war bonds. There was nothing for us to buy. Everybody had a job. Everybody was getting income, but there was nothing to buy. So people invested it. They invested it in loans to the government, war bonds, which would pay off once the war was over. As we saw in World War I, women increased their role in the workforce. From 1940 to 1945, the percentage of women in the workforce increased from 25% to 30%. So those 5 years, we saw a good substantial boost in women in the workforce. And we also saw an increase of wages. The American symbol of the woman in the workforce was Rosie the Riveter. Now, Rosie the Riveter is a fictional character, but based off of an actual person who worked building aircraft near Detroit, Michigan, or in Detroit, Michigan, the metro area anyway. This became a symbol of the American woman's new status in industry, and that women could hold these industrial factory jobs. We also saw during the war improvements in civil rights. Over 1 million African Americans worked in factories during the war. This is 1 million African Americans getting access to middle-class jobs, making a middle-class living, and entering into America's middle class. Now, wages were initially kept pretty low, but people fought back against this. A leader in that fight was A. Philip Randolph, this man right here, who threatened to lead a strike during wartime that would shut down all these wartime industries. Because of this threat of a strike and because of the work that Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, this is Theodore Roosevelt's wife, did with Randolph, and they worked with the administration, and because of that work, Roosevelt was able to outlaw job discrimination based upon race for companies with government contracts. Now, this is not the same as saying that we have equal rights in America, but this is a step in that direction. This is a step toward civil rights. If a company wants to have a government contract, they have to pay African American workers the same as they would white workers. That will later expand in the 1950s and 60s. The Bracero Program was related to Mexican Americans in particular. See, racism against Mexican Americans led to a drop in immigration during the 1930s. During the Great Depression, racism against Mexican Americans increased, as it does during every bad economic time in American history. Our economy gets bad and Americans become more racist toward Mexicans. But when the economy becomes good, Americans become less racist towards Mexicans. It's this pattern that we have followed throughout our history. And now that the economy is recovering, now that Americans need more and particularly low-cost labor, the U.S. is now encouraging immigration from Mexico. We set up the Bracero Program. Bracero is a strong arm program, to bring in more strong arms, more labor, particularly to fill shortages on the farms. American farmers are off to fight in World War II. We need to provide food for those Americans and others, and so we need more farm labor. And the Bracero Program will bring in 120,000 Mexicans into the United States in just 3 years. But we do have problems at home. No, nothing is perfect. The years of World War II did not see advances without setbacks. It's not all sunshine and roses. Racism was still a serious problem, and there were many examples within American society that we were still a very racist nation. We have a third Great Migration during this time, or a third migration. See, during Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, and during World War I, African Americans had migrated in large numbers to northern cities, and northern cities became more and more predominantly African American. And this happens again during World War II. African Americans fleeing the racism of the South to land in northern cities. But northern whites are reacting violently to this. Northern whites are starting to see their cities become less and less white, and a fear, racism is at its heart a fear of this change triggers a racist reaction amongst whites in many northern cities, most notably in Detroit and Chicago, which led to riots. This here is a picture of the Detroit race riot in 1943. Got pretty bad and led to a lot of what we call white flight. This is where many whites living in the city of Detroit fled and relocated out to the suburbs. We also saw the Zoot Suit riots. Mexican immigration into California had a similar impact on white populations in Los Angeles, as whites saw Los Angeles, which, yes, is a Mexican city. Whites saw Los Angeles becoming more and more Mexican. The Zoot Suit riots were named after these outfits, a gorgeous, lovely Zoot Suit, that were popular amongst Mexicans in the American Southwest at the time. These Zoot Suit riots were a reaction of whites who feared this migration and feared California becoming more and more Hispanic. And so they struck out against symbols of Mexican culture, the Zoot Suit. Finally, and this is the most extreme case of racism during World War I, is Japanese internment. This was the clearest example of racism. Japanese people were targeted because of actions of the Japanese government. The Japanese government had declared war on the United States, and there was this panic that any Japanese American living in the United States might be a Japanese spy and might be working for the Japanese government. And so they were all rounded up and put into internment camps. They were stripped of their property and sent to live in these camps for the duration of the war. Some Japanese were allowed to join the army, but they weren't allowed to fight in the Japanese war. They were sent over to Europe to fight. And those units actually distinguished themselves. They did very well in the war. But what is notable about this Japanese internment is that German Americans were not interned, not unless they had expressly stated support and worked toward the support of Nazi Germany. They were not imprisoned simply because they were German, whereas the Japanese were. Racism against Japanese. This was racism against Mexicans. Racism against African Americans. We are still a racist society during World War II. but it is worth noting that things were getting better. More economic opportunities for African Americans, greater acceptance and even encouragement of immigration, and of course, steps in women's labor. All right, I hope you learned something today. I know this was a fun lesson for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and farewell.